Good morning. I'm Corey Zimmerman. I work at the Center on the Developing Child at Harvard. Happy to be here with you this morning. Thanks for getting up bright and early to be here. So I'm going to jump right in. So when I tell folks that I work at the Center on the Developing Child, this is mostly what people imagine. This is what we talk about. We talk about brain science. We help translate it, make it actionable and accessible. It's what we did for the first 6 years, pretty much solely of our existence as a center. We talk about toxic stress. We talk about brain architecture. Sometimes we even play fun games and build brains out of pipe cleaners, if anybody was here on Tuesday. And we did that for about 6 years. And at a certain point, after going around the country enough and telling people about the science of early childhood, policymakers started to come back to us and said, all right, we believe you. What should we do? What should we invest in? And so what we did was we undertook a study and we looked at 50 years of program evaluations of early childhood programs. And we said, all right, what's out there? What's the best of what's happening? So this is the summary of it. The blue dots and red dots are the different studies we looked at, and the circles are the size, the number of kids that were in that study. And what we found was that over the last 50 years, we have as a field proven that we can make a difference in the lives of kids and families. We can have a positive impact. That yellow line, that average effect, is above 0. But what we also found when we looked deeper was that pretty much as a field, we haven't been able to replicate those early effects that we found in preschool and abecedarian. The huge impacts that we had on the set of kids who were in that research study. Thank you, speak up. We haven't been able to replicate. And so this led us to realize that we have a proof of concept in the early childhood field, but we have limited impact at scale. So what I want to talk to you about today is actually the work that we have been doing for the last 8 years to support ventures to use science-based innovation in order to achieve breakthrough outcomes for children and families facing adversity at scale. So this is our newer work. We continue to translate the science. That will always be part of what we do. But the newer work that we've been doing is actually working with ventures. And so what I want to share with you today is the work that we've been doing, that we've been co-discovering, co-creating, co-testing with over 100 ventures for this time. So as we got into the work, we had this big vision of wanting to reach impact at scale, right? That's the goal. That's the North Star. That's where we're trying to get to. And when we started this work, we had this idea that scale and your outcomes would go in parallel. That as you had evidence about the impact you were having on kids and families, so too with the number of families you would start to reach. Then we met some social entrepreneurs, and it doesn't work that way. And so our first aha was actually to realize that ventures have different maturity in terms of their impact and outcome strategy, and that's at a different maturity than their growth and scaling strategy. And so we realized that we were seeing teams who had strong impact, but they needed a scalable business model. We were also seeing teams who had a strong business model, but they needed to improve their impact. And more recently, we've been starting to see teams who are starting to design for impact and scale from the beginning. So you can think of it kind of like a map, right? Find where your venture is. What is your maturity in terms of your sustainable growth? What's your maturity in terms of your outcome strategy? And then think about what your path is. Do you need to go up and improve your outcome strategy? Do you need to move over in terms of scale? All with the goal of trying to get to that impact at scale most efficiently and as fast as we can. The other takeaway from this was to realize that it was outcomes times reach is what equals impact. So impact was having both outcomes, but having that reach as many kids as who needed it and as you could. So the next aha we had out of that was that reaching impact at scale is going to require going beyond business as usual. And it's going to require finding new ways of working. So that's what I want to share with you. I'm going to talk you through, it's going to come through as a mix of sort of here are the tools we've found that we've been working with ventures, here's insights that we've had working with them, new ways that we're finding work for teams and that are helping them move on that path towards impact at scale. So the next piece, as we got into working with teams, was that we realized that ventures were feeling this need for new ways of working, particularly acutely, during the phase of transitioning to scalability. So if you think of kind of a venture's growth, right, your intervention or your program as it grows, there's this early set of work where you're yeah, this is super exciting. We have a new idea. People want to fund it. It's super fun. Story goes, blah, 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 things happen. And then ta-da, we're at scale. And what we were finding was that there's this kind of neglected phase or under-talked about phase, which was the transition to scalability. It was that point where you had to switch from I know what I'm doing in this one place, and now I got to do something different if I'm going to get it to a lot of people. And what we found in particular was that actually this was the point where teams needed to add that other dimension. So if they've been mostly moving on a scale strategy, this was the point where they needed to add the impact side. Or if they've been mainly moving on an impact scale, this was the point strategy. This was the point where now they needed to start to figure out the business side and the sustainable growth strategy. So what are these new ways of working? Here's what we've been finding as we work with ventures. The first one is about using the science of early childhood as design principles. So let me unpack that a little bit. What I find right now is that the status quo in terms of the science is that most of us in the field use it for advocacy. We use it to justify why we're here in the field. We use it to try and convince others that they need to invest more in it. But we're leaving so much on the table. Nearest Neighborhoods was published in 2000. He's been around for a long time. There's a lot more science that's come out since then. And so instead, we're going to keep moving forward. It's great, keep using it for advocacy. And there's been more science since. And it has compelling new insights about how to inform innovation in policy and programs. Right? Like, we've known for a long time that some kids have positive outcomes and behaviors, some kids experience school failure and risky behaviors. We increasingly have a sense, though, actually about how experiences and genes interact and how they come together in the developmental pathways and how the conditions and environments interact with kids' genetic codes that they're coming in with to produce these outcomes. Guys, we understand it down to the molecular level. Like, there's new insights from the science that we can start to mine and understand. And more specifically, how science can help us achieve those better outcomes. So we kind of develop policies and programs, right? And we think that they're going to lead to better outcomes for kids and families. We measure the indicators of those by, like, yay, we've increased access, we've increased the quality to programs. We measure healthy child development by school achievement, self-sufficiency. But what the science is helping us understand is that actually those policies and programs are changing the experiences and conditions around children and families. And even more so, that there's very specific elements and components of those experiences and conditions which we know lead to better outcomes for kids and families. Building supportive relationships, strengthening core life skills, and reducing sources of stress. So we're going to take those three and we're going to call them design principles, right? So design principles, I realize I don't know if we quite want to still keep quoting Facebook, but whatever, we're going to go with it for today. So this is a quote: "The purpose of design principles is to align people around what matters. When push comes to shove and you have to make a trade-off, how are you in those moments going to prioritize? What are you going to care about the most?" So design principles are like your decision criteria. They're the thing you want to organize around, right? The thing that if you have to make a decision and if you have to make a trade-off, these are the things that you want to prioritize. So we can make those three principles, we can use them as design principles. Build responsive relationships, reduce sources of stress, and strengthen core life skills. These are three principles that are backed by so much research. And they have, yes, a little bit of an element of like, oh yeah, come on, like my grandma could have told me these were the important things. But the thing is that you know that if you organize around them, the research is behind you and the science is behind you, that these are what we best know lead to positive outcomes. So I present them as if they are three separate things, although they are actually quite interactive. And you would find that if you were emphasizing one, it might be another one that's sabotaging you, or, you know, like they are actually quite interactive. And they matter for both adults and for children. Yes, thank you. That they matter for both adults and for children. And that working on these three things, reducing sources of stress for adults, can free up bandwidth to be able to provide more responsive relationships to children. Helping strengthen children's life skills can help reduce stress for adults. Like there's an interplay between all three of these, which is actually quite powerful. So some ways that you can put them into action is you can think about, how does your product or intervention align with each of those principles? What is it that you're doing that aligns with them? You can ask yourself, what are ways that my product or intervention actually works against each of these principles? The fun place is actually where there's tension between the two. So like, say that an example would be like child welfare, that you get automatic access to an early intervention provider. That's great, you're providing additional services for the child, but now you've introduced another adult into that life, into that family's life that they need to coordinate with and appointments they need to. Maybe that's creating stress. And to think about those moments and those places of tension, and that's where the interesting innovation comes in sort of deciding why you're doing it and being intentional about it. Another fun thing, if you're familiar with the value proposition template, which we'll talk more about later, we did a really fun workshop with Promise the other week where we used actually those three design principles as the jobs to be done. So this is a template where you sort of think about who your customer is, and we said the child's our customer, and then you ask yourself, what's the job they're trying to do in the world? What is it they're trying to accomplish? And we said, well, what if we put those three things as their jobs to be done? They're trying to build responsive relationships and strengthen core life skills and reduce sources of stress. And then how does all of your product and everything you're doing align to helping that child do that? Anyways, it was a fun way to play with it. Okay, so that was a whirlwind of science by design. And all of these have like 90-minute, 3-hour workshops that are behind them. So like happy to talk more about any of it. Okay, so the second one is improving outcomes. The new way of working is improving outcomes by rapid cycle testing the hypotheses that are in your theory of change. So let me break that apart a little bit. What we find in status quo right now, when I say the word theory of change, usually it's these like terrible models, right? They're like ridiculously complex. Like, how does this help you know anything about your program? And then there's this version too, which is just not precise, which is like, I think you should be more specific here in step 2. So we find like this is one when I say theory of change, hold that in mind for a minute. And then the other thing that we find that happens in the field right now is that there's a mismatch between program goals and evaluations. So you say, yes, my program is about changing parenting. My program is about child health. But then what actually gets evaluated is not that. And so there's a mismatch between what we claim our program goals to be about and what we actually measure, which I don't take as malintent. I take it as it's a lack of precision and being clear about how what you're evaluating connects to your goals and the outcome that you're really trying to achieve in the world. So our approach aims for precision and simplicity. Think of it like pushing a set of dominoes. We have a particular theory of change template that we use, which is very simple and straightforward, and it's actually a lot of fun to work through with teams. So strategies, these are your program actions. This is like, what do you do in the world? What's the action that you are pushing in the world? Like in that little character, what is the action that you are doing to push something and to change it in the world? Targets are the knowledge, skills that are directly targeted by those strategies. What's the behavior, mindset, or skill that you are trying to change as a result of doing that? And I'm going to walk through an example next. And then outcomes are the ultimate goals. This is the meaningful difference in the life of a child or family that you are trying to make. What is the end goal? What is the meaningful difference in their life as a result of your intervention or your program or venture having been here? And then the bottom is moderators. Like what influences how somebody interacts with your venture? What influences how well the outcomes happen? Okay, let's play through an example. So there's been several actually ventures around this week who are about providing text messages to families. So that's their strategy. They provide information to parents via text messages about developmentally appropriate activities. Why do they do that? This is actually surprisingly hard for teams to actually really be precise. It's really fun, and it's fun also when you work through it with a team because you realize that like what you have in your head is not necessarily what your teammate thinks you're doing, and like actually getting everybody to have a similar clear pathway and set of dominoes about why you're doing it and what it happens. So in this example, let's imagine they are providing information to parents because they are trying to increase their knowledge of child development and they're trying to increase their confidence in parenting. And let's say that the outcome of that is improved parent-child relationship. And you could say the moderator. So what influences how well this intervention works? Like how many families are going to make it to those outcomes? And the moderators are things you have hypotheses about. Like usually you have a gut instinct about who's doing really well in your program and what are the things that are influencing where it's not going so well. So in this example, it could be parental mental health, it could be employment status, it could be housing stability. It would be up to the team and the venture about what they think is actually influencing it. So the first thing that we found is that it's super helpful for teams to actually work through this very simple theory of change about their impact and why they're doing it. And it helps nail down what often can be very murky and just like hand wavy at a certain point about like, yeah, and then there's going to be peace and rainbows and like world peace will happen. But the second part about what we use the theory of change for with teams is to make it be a stage-based evaluation. And so to encourage teams to start with your strategies. Like the first thing you need to know and evaluate, like there's so much pressure to go do an RCT and like prove that you have outcomes. And what we try and work with teams and have found really helpful is to say, slow down. Like jumping to outcomes is not going to help you. You want to work across this theory of change and build your story and your evaluation and evidence across it. Start with your strategies. Are they feasible and actionable? Does anyone come? Do people use them? That's the first thing you want data about. And that's usually like kind of access data. That's like the easy program data to collect is who showed up, how often. And then the targets is the one that I find people jump over the most because they're trying to get to outcomes fast. But this is actually usually where your secret sauce is. Like this is where your innovation usually is in the targets column. Like there's definitely innovation in the strategies. The outcomes are fairly common. Like, right, we work in the child and family field. Like the outcomes are fairly common, what we're all headed towards. But the targets are like your interesting insight about how you're going to change that outcome in a new and different way. Often we find that sometimes teams have to make up their own evaluation measure or survey or something to be able to measure those because it's like their unique insight. And then once you've gotten there, then you actually look to outcomes. Because the risk is that if you jump straight to outcomes and you don't know if you changed your targets, then you have no idea if it was you, right? Like you have no idea if it was you who actually was the result of what caused that outcome. And the other thing is that then encourage folks to use, so then moderators too, is that you use this as a way, these are all hypotheses. This is like your belief, your best guesses about how you're going to create impact in the world. And so you're then starting to test them out and rapid cycle test and create small experiments to be able to test them and be able to build your understanding about, is that first domino I'm pushing in the world strong enough to push those targets and strong enough then to push over to those outcomes? And if not, maybe you need more strategies, or maybe there's another target in there that actually you're changing, but you haven't kind of claimed credit and realized yet. So then following on that message is matching your evaluation design to your venture stage of development. So we really encourage teams to pull apart and think about that there are different types of studies you can do to build your evidence. The RCT, the randomized controlled trial, is very valuable at a certain stage once you have something that you're ready to put into that. There's so much work that you can do before that, which is cheaper, less expensive, you can do yourself, about sort of working through the different stages of study. And of course, we encourage teams to increase your rigor as you go. Like this is, you do want to be building towards evidence, but that's not the thing you must do today. You can work towards that. Okay, that's like a whole 3-day workshop, so there's like so much more there. All right, third one, building a sustainable growth strategy. This is the third one. So in this case, what I find why people aren't doing it is often just not knowing. Like not knowing how to start. We had a first cohort of teams that we worked with. A few of them were academic entrepreneurs. And one of them came up to me, he's like, all I've been taught about how to scale is to hire another grad student. Like that's all that we were ever taught about what this was supposed to be. And I was like, okay, that's like a good place to start, but that's probably not gonna get you all the way there. And I find often that in the field there's both not the slack to take a risk, like there's not the capacity or bandwidth to be able to afford the space to take the risks. And it's just like not a behavior that's been particularly rewarded in the early childhood field. And I think going out and building your scale strategy requires a fair amount of risk and going out and trying to figure it out and just like jumping into that unknown, unfamiliar space. What I've found interesting about building the scale strategy is that it really starts by asking who's the customer for whom you are creating value. And I feel like, so this part of the work has been newer to me in the last couple of years I've come up in the early childhood field. At first when folks started into this, I was like, of course we know our customers. What are you talking about? Like we work with them all the time. We know the ventures, like we know the parents, we know kids. And like this approach really forces you to get deeply into, it's very human-centered design, like really deeply take their perspective and understand it, and then figure out how what you're doing maps to what they're trying to do. But it is certainly true that the answer to who is your customer can be very complicated in early childhood. It's not as straight just like we have a product and we sell it and someone buys it. There's often 3 different customers that you're trying to figure out who to work with. So there is the beneficiary, which is often the child. It could be a parent. But there's who actually benefits from your work. Sometimes there's an intermediary, like actually you need to convince a parent to do something in order to reach that child. Or there's a teacher, or there's a pediatrician, like there's a middle kind of customer. And that can all be different than the person who's actually paying. So the payer might actually be state government, it could be a director of programs within a large nonprofit. Sometimes it's the parent themselves, but like it's just really, it's messy in our space. And so I think owning that and acknowledging that is really helpful and allows you to start to disentangle that for each of these, you would have a different pitch. Each of these you might have different materials. Each of these you have a different, we'll get in the next slide, but a different value proposition, like a different reason why what you're doing is helpful to them and different ways of explaining that. So just embrace the complexity, it's okay. The other piece of what's been really fun to find is that there are existing tools that can help you articulate your value proposition to your customers. So like these come out of Lean Startup. There's a website, strategizer.com, which has a lot of these fun tools. But there are ways of getting you to really try and break down. And the same way that theory of change helps you be precise, I find that these are equally as hard because they're trying to get you to be precise about what are you doing that's really of value to the jobs that your customer is trying to get done in the world. Like what are they trying to accomplish and how do you map what you're doing to what they're doing? Anyways, these are fun. And then another tool that we've used a lot with teams has been the Lean Business Model Canvas. And there is an impact version also of it. This is like a cartoonish version of it, but the basic idea is that in the same way that theory of change helps you map your impact hypotheses, this helps you map your hypotheses about how are you going to grow. What's the front end of your business going to look like, and what's the back end? But it asks it in really helpful ways of like, so how are you going to reach your customers? Like, how are you actually going to reach those kids and families? Or how are you going to reach the person who's paying? And then the back end piece is about like, what are the staff that you need to build that? What are the resources you need to do? And it's fun. Like it's intentionally all squeezed onto one page. And you can do it like as in fast as an hour, and then you can spend like the next 6 years iterating on it. Yeah, it's as much as you put into it. And it's another one like theory of change that like as you get into it, it's increasingly complex or like as you get deeper into it. But it holds your hypotheses, and they're meant to go out and test. And they help you articulate what your assumptions are about how you're going to grow, so that you can go out then and test them and figure them out in the world. Okay, so I want to offer some just last further considerations that we've found for transitioning to scalability in the early childhood sector. There aren't many roadmaps to follow. There aren't many folks who have done this. There aren't a whole lot of folks who have actually reached impact at scale. And so in comparison, in other fields, there are models. There's stories about like, oh, if you act like this venture did this and made it this way, so like you can kind of follow their playbook. We don't have a lot of those in early childhood. People haven't gotten there yet. So we're super eager to connect and support those who are forging the road ahead. The next is, what we found is that it's a fragmented market with many channels and systems to reach children and families. Early childhood is a 5 years of phase of life of human beings. Like it is not one system, it is not education, it is not health. Like we encompass all of it. We reach housing and homelessness reaches families in this period, TANF and cash assistance reaches families in this period, pediatricians. There are so many different ways to reach kids and families in these 5 years, which makes it really fun and exciting. But it's helpful then to build your knowledge and be creative about considering unusual options. And I think for folks sometimes who are new to the field, it's a bit overwhelming about like, whoa, there's so many different ones. And yet I think just to embrace that, again, embrace the complexity and be creative in it. And then the last one I say that we've found is that the innovation ecosystem in early childhood is still relatively young. It's still building up the infrastructure support that's needed to help support teams who are moving into this innovation space and ventures who are moving into this innovation space. Other fields have a much more robust set of accelerators and funding and demo days and mentors. Like other fields have much more robust support for those who are trying to venture into the innovation space. And so I appreciate, make known what you need. Help articulate, like for those of us who are intermediaries, the more that we can understand what it is you need that it would take to help you be successful, the better we can be at trying to help build that or like encourage growth of that. And also, that's what's exciting actually about Futurebound, right? Like they're trying to do that here in Colorado, and so everything that we can all do to help contribute to their success. Okay, so just a reminder, here's why we're here. It's about reaching breakthrough outcomes for kids and families. Last slide is just, here's our website. Encourage you to check it out for more. Although I'll tell you a lot of what I've been talking about is sort of our newer work, and so there's a little bit of a lag time before it gets up on the website, but feel free to check it out. That's what I had planned to say. We still have about 15 minutes or so I would welcome questions or discussion or thoughts or reflections from those in the audience. Why don't we do a minute, allow folks to reflect, turn and talk to your neighbor for just a sec about like observations and thoughts, and then we'll come back together as a group and would love to collect this.
Sorry, I have a quick question.
Yeah.
I really appreciate a lot of your diagrams and how you display the information
Yeah.
and help us think through it. Are some of the slides or the information in the slides available on the website, or will they make the slides available?
Oh, that's a good question. I'm sure I can follow up with them and make the slides available to everybody. Yeah, happy to.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. All right, turn and talk to your neighbor, have a few reflections, and then we'll come back together as a group. All right, let's come back together. Hi, everybody. Sorry to interrupt. Those sound like they were rich conversations. I would love if there are a few folks who want to share something interesting that your neighbor said or an interesting reflection that you've had. Just would welcome thoughts or reflections, ideas that popped for you or insights or things that totally don't resonate. I would welcome hearing those too.
My neighbor had a great thought, which I think is true, that this is extremely important and core to business. And there's not a big willingness for funders to pay for this kind of thing. So I think that's all true.
I hear
There's an emerging interest in paying, but the work to get this done is notable.
Yeah, I appreciate. I hear need of funding, and we have certainly found with teams that the thing that is not your core strength is the harder thing to raise funding for, right? Like, so there's money that's available if you're more of a traditional nonprofit. Like, there's funding available for direct service, there's funding for evaluation, but it tends to be hard to find the funding for growth and scaling. And the same for the teams who come from more of the kind of growth and scaling and social entrepreneur side. They find it's really hard to find funding to measure their impact and evaluation. But I think that's a super helpful need to articulate, and one that we can put out to Futurebound also and say, we need funding to be able to cross over and do the other pieces. Yeah, Mark.
And one of the reasons I raised that point is because if it looks like general operating funding, or if it looks like capacity building funding, there's just not as much interest in the field for that as there is for program funding.
Yes. Yeah. No, it's hard. I do think that there are.
Even though this is program funding in some ways.
Yeah. I do find that there are a small number of growing funders who are interested and have more of kind of an innovation mindset and want to support that in the fields. But I hear that I completely support and agree that there's still a need for more. Thanks. Yeah, others. You guys were all super chatty a minute ago. Yeah, please.
I think building on that too is the sustained funding it takes, because this is so new and there's no room for the problem. Funders want to fund innovation, but then you're pushed to go find someone to sustain the funding, and your customer around children and families can't sustain it as a fee-for-service. So that's part of the funding.
Yeah. Yeah, I would agree with the sustained funding, and I do, thanks. I do find that what I have found fascinating as social entrepreneurs come more into the field is that they just have a totally different approach to how they think about funding and where revenue sources are going to come from. And I feel like it's been a really different approach than how my own self coming up in the nonprofit government side of the field understood funding mechanisms to exist. Don Burton was back there a minute ago, who is a venture capital guy, and the way he just thinks about available money options is different. And so I think the more that we can get those out there, because there is a need for sustained funding through the different phases. Oh, sorry. Yes. Yes, sorry. Dean, did you want to add?
We're finding it's really different. For our core program model that's been around for 20 years, we've done a lot of evidence building over the last 10. We were able to get some substantial funding for those larger studies, and so great positive impact. I find it interesting that there are fewer and fewer donors that care about that impact, which is sort of interesting. So great, you've proven it, but what's next? And so we're finding more interest on the innovation side, but I agree with what other people are saying about after you've started to do some of that innovation, there's more funding for growing that and making the impact on the number side and not on the actual impact, child development benefits or other benefits. I think there are different kinds of funders out there, and trying to figure out and know that landscape for who's going to fund innovation, who's going to fund. There are very few operating funds that can help you continue to sustain, and I agree, fee-for-service is not always something that's sustainable.
Right, right. Yeah, I think there's strong incentives. Different funders push strong incentives. Some are I need the growth numbers. Some are I need the impact side. And in part, that's what we're trying to push is there's got to be a middle road here. In order to reach impact at scale, we need both of those. And we need the best of both those worlds to come together, and then throw some science in there. But I agree, the funder landscape, it's still a very wide and mixed set of what they're incentivizing and what they're rewarding. Yeah, other thoughts? Yeah, please.
I'm curious if you have an example of a venture or an innovation that you've worked with recently. So, I mean, certainly working in early childhood for a while, I feel that there's a lot of effective and evidence-based programs and supports and things that we are already working to scale. So, would love to kind of hear an example of something recent and really with the idea that I'm trying to expand my thinking beyond why aren't we focusing on things we know that work and how to scale those. So, have examples.
Two thoughts. One, I think that as knowing that there are things that work and wanting to figure out how to scale them, I do think that that's where a lot of it's partly where I find a lot of the social entrepreneurs focus is like, because the innovation is in that strategy column of the theory of change. It's like, we're going to take a known best practice and we're going to figure out a new way to get it out to 1 million more people. And so I do think that there's very much need and space for that, right? Like screening. We know screening works. That's like not a new thing that needs to be proven. What needs to be figured out is how do we get it out to 1 million more kids? And so like that's where I find a lot of the technology comes in, or new ways of using apps or AI. Like it's helping with the distribution side of things. And like there's definitely a need for that. I find sometimes there's innovation, again, for best practices or existing known things in the finance model. My Village is one that works, is basically building a family childcare network, right? And so what they're trying to figure out, they're innovating on the financial backside of what it takes to run a family childcare business and a network of them. It's not a new idea, family childcare and a network, but their innovation is around the financial side of it. Then an example of one who I think has been treading more into this space of trying to bridge the worlds between both impact and scale. We work closely with FIND, which is an intervention out of University of Oregon and Phil Fisher's team. It's filming interactions to nurture development. So they came out of and have spent a long time working in the child welfare system. They work in homeless shelters. They work with kids and families facing adversity and the public systems that then support them. More recently, in the last years, in an attempt to try and figure out how to diversify their funding model, they've started to figure out, is there a version that we could sell to higher income families? Is there a package or version of our program where we film interactions for families and provide them feedback and support that families would pay for? And so they've been piloting it and trying to figure out, like, is there a market for that? What would we charge? How much would it pull away from our other resources serving it? But what they're seeing is, like, it's a way to subsidize the core mission work they want to do, but trying to diversify their revenue model so they're not 100% dependent on grant funding and state and government funding. So there's just an interesting example, right? Like a way of trying to bridge between those two worlds. Does that answer your question?
Yes,
Yeah.
I do
Yeah.
really well with examples.
Yeah, cool. I think we have time for one more thought or comment before our time is come to a close. Anybody else have a thought? Nobody wants to be the last word? Yeah, please.
I really appreciate that you were able to display a very simple yet efficient theory of change model.
Yeah.
As a researcher right now, that's something that my team and I are trying to do for our organization to update our theory of change model.
Yeah.
But a lot of times when you suggest that to people, there's a lot of pushback because people are thinking of those highly complex diagrams that you showed.
Yeah.
So having that to back is very helpful.
Good. I'm glad. And I will say, if you're going to take back and work with your team, is to pick a small unit of focus. You know, like pick off one piece at a time because it's easier to map it and make it more precise than like, we're going to map our entire program, but like, let's take this piece. And then eventually either you end up with multiple theories of change or you start to see where they overlap. Like, oh, we're doing all these things because they hit that same target. And like you find the overlap points. But good, I'm glad it was useful. Okay, everybody, thank you so much. I'm so glad you've been here this morning. Welcome, please feel free to follow up. I would love more questions or answers or contact. This is certainly how we learn and grow, is by working and interacting and through examples and learning and testing. But yeah, please feel free to follow up and have a great rest of your day. Thanks.